So we're going to do a little Whitehead Seance. I'm going to read 10 pages, roughly, from Process and Reality, from Part 2, Discussions and Applications, where he's talking about the propositions and the nature of a metaphysical proposition. He gives the example of arithmetic and then goes into the way that inductive generalization and the theory of statistics have certain metaphysical presuppositions or underpinnings, and he wants to surface those. And by the end of that discussion, he is affirming that there is a non-statistical source of judgment of probability, and he calls it this source the primordial nature of God, and the graduated intensive relevance of eternal objects or pure potentials that this primordial nature provides to each finite actual occasion. And it's because of this graduated intensive relevance of eternal objects granted to every actual occasion that there can be relevant novelty in the course of physical events. And it's why as natural philosophers, our inductive judgments of probability are possible, right? Because there is this imprint, which is a hylomorphic way of saying it, but there is this initial aim, to put it in more process relational terms, that would also be an objective aim. It's an ingredient, not determining what happens in the concrescence of each actual occasion, but influencing it and meeting and mingling with a subjective aim, unique, local, once occurrent, which is another ingredient in the concrescence of an actual occasion, right? So the objective aim is not determining, the subjective aim is influencing it, but the decision that's made whereby that subject perishes into and really gives itself over to a superjective future orientation and other orientation, then there's a transition which occurs that allows for the transmission of feelings, right, out of the past through the present and into the future. And the whole of cosmogenesis is the rhythmic pulsation of this process of concrescence and transition, receiving the past into the present and gifting it to the future. It's always a work done in the present, and for Whitehead, it is theurgic. It is divine work. So let's proceed with the seance. I'm reading from page 197 of the corrected edition of Process and Reality. A metaphysical proposition, in the proper general sense of the term, metaphysical, signifies a proposition which, 1, has meaning for any actual occasion, as a subject entertaining it, and 2, is general in the sense that its predicate potentially relates any and every set of actual occasions, providing the suitable number of logical subjects for the predicative pattern, and 3, has a uniform truth value, in the sense that, by reason of its form and scope, its truth value is identical with the truth value of each of the singular propositions to be obtained by restricting the application of the predicate to any one set of logical subjects. It is obvious that, if a metaphysical proposition be true, the third condition is unnecessary. For a general proposition can only be true if this condition be fulfilled. But if the general proposition be false, then it is only metaphysical when, in addition, each of the derivate singular propositions is false. The general proposition would be false if any one of the derivate singular propositions were false, but the third condition is expressed in the proposition without any dependence upon the determination of the proposition's truth or falsehood. There can be no cosmic epoch for which the singular propositions derived from a metaphysical proposition differ in truth value from those of any other cosmic epoch. We certainly think that we entertain metaphysical propositions, but having regard to the mistakes of the past, respecting the principles of geometry, it is wise to reserve some skepticism on this point. The propositions which seem to be most obviously metaphysical are the arithmetical theorems. I will therefore illustrate the justification both for the belief and for the residual skepticism by an examination of one of the simplest of such theorems. 1 and 1 makes 2. And there's a footnote. For the proof of this proposition, see Principia Mathematica, Volume 2. Back to the main text. Certainly, this proposition, construed in the sense one entity and another entity make two entities, seems to be properly metaphysical without any shadow of limitation upon its generality or truth. But we must hesitate even here when we notice that it is usually asserted with equal confidence as to the generality of its metaphysical truth, in a sense which is certainly limited and sometimes untrue. In our reference to the actual world, we rarely consider an individual actual entity. The objects of our thoughts are almost always societies or looser groups of actual entities. Or like a nexus would be Whitehead's term for that. Now, for the sake of simplicity, consider a society of the personal type. Such a society will be a linear succession of actual occasions forming a historical root in which some defining characteristic is inherited by each occasion from its predecessors. A society of this sort is an enduring object. Probably a simple enduring object is simpler than anything which we ordinarily perceive or think about. It is the simplest type of society, and for any duration of its existence, it requires that its environment be largely composed of analogous, simple, enduring objects. What we normally consider is the wider society, in which many strands of enduring objects are to be found. We can call this a corpuscular society. Now consider two distinct enduring objects. They will be easier to think about if their defining characteristics are different. We will call these defining characteristics A and B, and also will use these letters A and B as the names of the two enduring objects. Now, the proposition one entity and another entity make two entities is usually construed in the sense that, given to enduring objects, any act of attention which consciously comprehends an actual occasion from each of the two historic roots will necessarily discover two actual occasions, one from each of the two distinct roots. For example, suppose that a cup and a saucer are two such enduring objects, which of course they are not. We always assume that, so long as they are both in existence and are sufficiently close to be seen in one glance, any act of attention whereby we perceive the cup and perceive the saucer will thereby involve the perception of two actual entities, one the cup in one occasion of its existence, and the other the saucer in one occasion of its existence. There can be no reasonable doubt as to the truth of this assumption in this particular example, but in making it, we are very far from the metaphysical proposition which we started. We are in fact stating a truth concerning the wide societies of entities amid which our lives are placed. It is a truth concerning this cosmos, but not a metaphysical truth. Let us return to the two truly simple enduring objects, A and B. Also, let us assume that their defining characteristics, A and B, are not contraries, so that both of them can qualify the same actual occasion. Then, there's no general metaphysical reason why the distinct roots of A and B should not intersect in at least one actual occasion. Indeed, having regard to the extreme generality of the notion of a simple enduring object, It is practically certain that, with the proper choice for the defining characteristics, A and B, intersecting historic roots for A and B must have frequently come into existence. In such a contingency, a being who could consciously distinguish the two distinct enduring objects, A and B, so as to have knowledge of their distinct defining characteristics and their distinct historic roots, might find A and B exemplified in one actual entity. It is as though the cup and the saucer were at one instant identical, and then, later on, resumed their distinct existence. We hardly ever apply arithmetic in its pure metaphysical sense, without the addition of presumptions which depend for their truth on the character of the societies dominating the cosmic epoch in which we live. It is hardly necessary to draw attention to the fact that ordinary verbal statements make no pretense of discriminating the different senses in which an arithmetical statement can be understood. There is no difficulty in imagining a world, i.e., a cosmic epoch, in which arithmetic would be an interesting fanciful topic for dreamers, but useless for practical people engrossed in the business of life. In fact, we seem to have only barely been rescued from such a state of things. Come here. For amid the actual occasions located in the wilds of so-called empty space, quote unquote, and well removed from the enduring objects which go to form the enduring material bodies, it is quite probable that the contemplation of arithmetic would not direct attention to any very important relations of things. It is, of course, a mere speculation that any actual entity occurring in such an environment of faintly coordinated achievement achieves the intricacy of constitution required for conscious mental operations. We ask the metaphysical question: what is there in the nature of things whereby an inductive inference, or a judgment of general truth, can be significantly termed correct or incorrect? For example, we believe now, July 1st, 1927, that the railway timetables for the United States, valid for the previous months of May and June, represent the facts as to the past running of the trains, within certain marginal limits of unpunctuality, and allowing for a few individual breakdowns. Also, we believe that the current timetables for July will be exemplified, subject to the same qualifications. On the evidence before us, our beliefs are justified, provided that we introduce into our judgments some estimate of the high probability, which is all that we mean to affirm. If we are considering astronomical events, our affirmations will include an estimate of a higher probability, though even here, some margin of uncertainty may exist. The computers of some famous observatory may have made an unprecedented error, or some unknown physical law may have important relevance to the condition of the star mainly concerned, leading to its unexpected explosion. There's a footnote. Since this sentence was written in July 1927, a star has unexpectedly split in two in March 1928. Back to the main text. The astronomical contingency and the beliefs which cluster round it have been stated with some detail, because, as thus expressed, they illustrate the problem as it shapes itself in philosophy. Also, the example of the railway timetables illustrates another point, for it is possible momentarily in Vermont on July 1st, 1927, to forget that the unprecedented Mississippi floods happened during that May and June, so that although the estimate as to error in punctuality was justified by the evidence consciously before us, it did not in fact allow for the considerable derangement of the traffic in some states in the Union. Another footnote: still less, at the time of writing this sentence, were the Vermont floods of November 1927 foreseen. Back to the main text. The point of this illustration from railway trains is that there is a conformity to matter of fact which these judgments exhibit, even if the events concerned have not happened or will not happen. These considerations introduce the fundamental principle concerning judgment. It is that all judgment is categorical. It concerns a proposition, true or false, in its application to the actual occasion which is the subject making the judgment. The doctrine is not so far from F.H. Bradley's doctrine of judgment, as explained in his book Logic. According to Bradley, the ultimate subject of every judgment is the one ultimate substance, the absolute. Also, according to him, the judging subject is a mode of the absolute, self-contradictory if taken to be independently actual. For Bradley, the judging subject has only a derivative actuality, which is the expression of its status as an affection of the absolute. Thus, in Bradley's doctrine, a judgment is an operation by which the absolute, under the limitations of one of its affections, enjoys self-consciousness of its enjoyment of affections. It will be noticed that in this bald summary of Bradley's position, I am borrowing Spinoza's phrase, substantial affections. In the philosophy of organism, an actual occasion, as has been stated above, is the whole universe in process of attainment of a particular satisfaction. Bradley's doctrine of actuality is simply inverted. The final actuality is the particular process with its particular attainment of satisfaction. The actuality of the universe is merely derivative from its solidarity in each actual entity. It must be held that judgment concerns the universe as objectified from the standpoint of the judging subject. It concerns the universe through that subject. With this doctrine in mind, we pass to the discussion of the sense in which probability can be a positive fact in an actual entity, so that a proposition expressing the probability of some other proposition can, in this respect, agree or disagree with the constitution of the judging entity. The notion of probability, in the widest sense of that term, presents a puzzling philosophical problem. The mathematical theory of probability is based upon certain statistical assumptions. When these assumptions hold, the meaning of probability is simple, and the only remaining difficulties are concerned with the technical mathematical development. But it is not easy to understand how the statistical theory can apply to all cases to which the notion of more or less probability is habitually applied. For example, when we consider, as we do consider, the probability of some scientific conjecture as to the internal constitution of the stars, or as to the future of human society after some unprecedented convulsion, we seem to be influenced by some analogy which it is very difficult to convert into an appeal to any definite statistical fact. We may consider that it is probable that the judgment could be justified by some statistical appeal if we only knew where to look. This is the belief that the statistical probability is itself probable. But here, evidently, there is an appeal to a wider meaning of probability in order to support the statistical probability applicable to the present case. It is arguable that this wider probability is itself another statistical probability as to the existence of the special statistics relevant to such types of scientific argument. But in this explanation, puzzling questions are accumulating, and it is impossible to avoid the suspicion that we are being put off with one of those make-believe explanations, so useful to reasoners who are wedded to a theory. The philosophy of organism provides two distinct elements in the universe from which an intuition of probability can originate. One of them is statistical. In this and the next two sections, an attempt will be made to justify this statistical theory. It is therefore the more imperative to survey carefully the difficulties which have to be met. In the first place, probability is always relative to evidence. So, on the statistical theory, the numerical probability will mean the numerical ratio of favorable to unfavorable cases in the particular class of cases selected as the ground for statistical comparison. But alternative grounds certainly exist. Accordingly, we must provide a reason not based upon probability why one ground is selected rather than another. We may admit such a chain of vaguer and vaguer probabilities in which our first ground is selected as statistically probable in respect to its superiority to other grounds of other types. We are thus driven back to a second-order ground of probability. We may logically proceed to third-order grounds and so on. But if the statistical theory is to be substantiated, after a finite number of steps, we must reach a ground which is not selected for any reason of probability. It must be selected because it is the ground presupposed in all our reasonings. Apart from some such ultimate ground, the statistical theory, viewed as an ultimate explanation for all our uses of the notion of probability, must inevitably fail. This failure arises by reason of the complete arbitrariness of the ultimate ground upon which the whole estimate of probability finally rests. Secondly, the primary requisite for a ground suitable for statistical probability seems itself to appeal to probability. The members of the class called the ground must themselves be cases of equal probability, some favorable and some unfavorable, with the possibility of the limiting types of ground in which all members are favorable or all members are unfavorable. The proposition in question, whose probability is to be estimated, must be known to be a member of the ground, but no other evidence as to the set, favorable or unfavorable, to which the proposition belongs, enters into consideration. It is evident that, for the ultimate ground, the phrase cases of equal probability must be explicable without reference to any notion of probability. The principle of such an explanation is easily found by reference to the 6 faces of dice. A die is a given fact, and its faces do not differ, qua faces, in any circumstance relative to their fall, with one face upwards or another face down, or another face upwards. Also, beyond this given fact, there is ignorance. Thus, again, we are driven to an ultimate fact. There must be an ultimate species, and the specific character must be irrelevant to the favorableness or unfavorableness of the members of the species in their capacity of cases. All this must be given in direct knowledge without any appeal to probability. Also, there must be equally distinct knowledge of the proportion of favorable or unfavorable cases within the species, at least within the limits of precision or vagueness presupposed in the conclusion. Thirdly, it is another requisite for a ground that the number of instances which it includes be finite. The whole theory of the ratios of cardinal numbers, on which statistical probability depends, breaks down when the cardinal numbers are infinite. Fourthly, the method of sampling professes to evade 2 objections. One of them is the breakdown mentioned above when the number of cases in the ground is infinite. The other objection thus evaded is that, in practice, the case in question is novel and does not belong to the ground which is in fact examined. According to this second objection, unless there is some further evidence, the statistical state of the ground is bogus evidence as to the probability of the case in question. To sum up, the method of sampling professes to overcome 1, the difficulty arising from the infinity of the ground, and 2, that arising from the novelty of the case in question, whereby it does not belong to the ground examined. In the discussion, it must be remembered that we are considering the ultimate ground which must not require any appeal to probability beyond itself. Thus, the statistical facts as to the ground must be given and not merely probable. When we have an infinite ground, containing an indefinite number of favorable cases and an indefinite number of unfavorable cases, random sampling can give no help towards the establishment of statistical probability. For one reason, becomes no such notion of ratios. For one reason, because no such notion of ratios can apply to these infinities. And for another reason, no sample is random. It has only followed a complex method. A finite number of samples, each following some method of its own, however complex each method may be, will give a statistical result entirely dependent upon those methods. Insofar as repetitions of so-called random samplings give concordant results, the only conclusion to be drawn is that there is a relevant, though concealed, analogy between the random methods. Thus, a finite ground is essential for statistical probability. It must be understood that this argument implies no criticism on a properly interpreted method of sampling applied to a finite ground. When the case in question does not belong to the ground examined, there can, apart from further information, be no rational inference from the ground to the novel case. If probability be in truth purely statistical, and if there be no additional information, there can be no escape from this conclusion. But we certainly do unhesitatingly argue from a ground which does not include the case in question, to a probable conclusion concerning the case in question. Thus, either such an inference is irrational, futile, useless, or, when there is justification, there is additional information. This is the famous dilemma which perplexes the theories of induction and of probability. It is evident that the ultimate ground to which all probable judgments must refer can be nothing else than the actual world as objectified in judging subjects. A judging subject is always passing a judgment upon its own data. Thus, if the statistical theory is to hold, the relations between the judging subject and its data must be such as to evade the difficulties which beset that theory. Every actual entity is, in its nature, essentially social, and this in two ways. First, the outlines of its own character are determined by the data which its environment provides for its process of feeling. Secondly, these data are not extrinsic to the entity. They constitute that display of the universe which is inherent in that entity. Thus, the data upon which the subject passes judgment are themselves components conditioning the character of the judging subject. It follows that any general presupposition as to the character of the experiencing subject also implies a general presupposition as to the social environment providing the display for that subject. In other words, a species of subject requires a species of data as its preliminary phase of concrescence. But such data are nothing but the social environment under the abstraction affected by objectification. Also, the character of the abstraction itself depends on the environment. The species of data requisite for the presumed judging subject presupposes an environment of a certain social character. Thus, according to the philosophy of organism, inductive reasoning gains its validity by reason of a suppressed premise. This tacit presupposition is that the particular future, which is the logical subject of the judgment, inductively justified, shall include actualities which have close analogy to some contemporary subject enjoying assigned experience. For example, an analogy to the judging subject in question, or to some sort of actuality presupposed, as in the actual world, which is the logical subject of the inductive judgment. It is also presumed that this future is derived from the present by a continuity of inheritance in which this condition is maintained. There is thus the presupposition of the maintenance of the general social environment, either by reference to judging subjects or by more direct reference to the preservation of the general type of material world requisite for the presupposed character of one or more of the logical subjects of that proposition. In this connection, I can only repeat as a final summary a paragraph from my Science and the Modern World. Quote from Chapter 3. You will observe that I do not hold induction to be, in its essence, the divination of general laws. It is the derivation of some characteristics of a particular future from the known characteristics of a particular past. The wider assumption of general laws holding for all cognizable occasions appears a very unsafe addendum to attach to this limited knowledge. All we can ask of the present occasion is that it shall determine a particular community of occasions, which are, in some respects, mutually qualified by reason of their inclusion within that same community." End quote. It is evident that in this discussion of induction, the philosophy of organism appears as an enlargement of the premise in ethical discussions that man is a social animal. Analogously, every actual occasion is social, so that when we have presumed the existence of any persistent type of actual occasions, we have thereby made presumptions as to types of societies comprised in its environment. Another way of stating this explanation of the validity of induction is that in every forecast there is a presupposition of a certain type of actual entities, and that the question then asked is, under what circumstances will these entities find themselves? The reason that an answer can be given is that the presupposed types of entities require a presupposed type of data for the primary phases of these actual entities, and that a presupposed type of data requires a presupposed type of social environment. But the laws of nature are the outcome of the social environment. Hence, when we have presupposed a type of actual occasions, we have already some information as to the laws of nature in operation throughout that environment. In every inductive judgment, there is therefore contained a presupposition of the maintenance of the general order of the immediate environment, so far as concerns actual entities within the scope of the induction. The inductive judgment has regard to the statistical probabilities inherent in this given order. The anticipations are devoid of meaning apart from the definite cosmic order which they presuppose. Also, survival requires order, and to presuppose survival apart from the type of order which that type of survival requires is a contradiction. It is at this point that the organic philosophy differs from any form of Cartesian substance philosophy. For if a substance requires nothing but itself in order to exist, its survival can tell no tale as to the survival of order in its environment. Thus, no conclusion can be drawn respecting the external relationships of the surviving substance to its future environment. For the organic philosophy, anticipations as to the future of a piece of rock presuppose an environment with the type of order which that piece of rock requires. Thus, the completely unknown environment never enters into an inductive judgment. The induction is about the statistical probabilities of this environment, or about the graded relevance to it of eternal objects. Thus, the appeal to the mere unknown is automatically ruled out. The question as to what will happen to an unspecified entity in an unspecified environment has no answer. Induction always concerns societies of actual entities which are important for the stability of the immediate environment. In the preceding section, there has been a covert appeal to probability. It is the purpose of this section to explain how the probability thus invoked can be explained according to the statistical theory. First, we have to note exactly where this appeal to probability enters into the notion of induction. An inductive argument always includes a hypothesis, namely, that the environment which is the subject matter considered contains a society of actual occasions analogous to a society in the present. But analogous societies require analogous data for their several occasions, and analogous data can be provided only by the objectifications provided by analogous environments. But the laws of nature are derived from the characters of the societies dominating the environment. Thus, the laws of nature dominating the environment in question have some analogy to the laws of nature dominating the immediate environment. Now, the notions of analogy and of dominance both leave a margin of uncertainty. We can ask, how far analogous and how far dominant? If there were exact analogy and complete dominance, there would be a mixture of certainty as to general conditions and a complete ignorance as to specific details. But such a description does not apply either to our knowledge of the immediate present or of the past, or to our inductive knowledge of the future. Our conscious experience involves a baffling mixture of certainty, ignorance, and probability. Now, it is evident that the theory of cosmic epochs, due to the dominance of societies of actual occasions, provides the basis for a statistical explanation of probability. In any one epoch, there are a definite set of dominant societies in certain ordered interconnections. There is also an admixture of chaotic occasions which cannot be classified as belonging to any society. But, having regard to the enormous extension of any cosmic epoch, we are practically dealing with infinities, so that some method of sampling is required, rooted in the nature of the case and not arbitrarily adopted. This natural method of sampling is provided by the data which form the primary phase of any one actual occasion. Each actual occasion objectifies the other actual occasions in its environment. This environment can be limited to the relevant portion of the cosmic epoch. It is a finite region of the extensive continuum so far as adequate importance is concerned in respect to individual differences among actual occasions. Also, in respect to the importance of individual differences, we may assume that there is a lower limit to the extension of each relevant occasion within this region. With these two presumptions, it follows that the relevant objectifications, forming the relevant data for any one occasion, refer to a finite sample of actual occasions in the environment. Accordingly, our knowledge of the external world, and of the conditions upon which its laws depend, is, through and through, of that numerical character which a statistical theory of probability requires. Such a theory does not require that exact statistical calculations be made. All that is meant by such a theory is that our probability judgments are ultimately derivable from vague estimates of more or less in a numerical sense. We have an unprecise intuition of the statistical basis of the sort of way in which things happen. There's a note where Whitehead writes, "By far the best discussion of the philosophical theory of probability is to be found in Mr. John Maynard Keynes's book, A Treatise on Probability. This treatise must long remain the standard work on the subject. My conclusions in this chapter do not seem to me to differ fundamentally from those of Mr. Keynes, as set out towards the conclusion of his chapter 21, but Mr. Keynes here seems to revert to a view of probability very analogous to that form of the frequency theory which, as suggested by me, he criticized acutely and rightly so far as concerned that special form in his chapter 8. Back to the main text. So far, the argument of the three preceding sections has been devoted to the explanation of the statistical ground for a probability judgment. But the same discussion also discloses an alternative, non-statistical ground for such a judgment. The main line of thought has been, 1. That each actual occasion has at the base of its own constitution the environment from which it springs. 2. That in this function of the environment, abstraction has been made from its indefinite multiplicity of forms of definiteness, so as to obtain a concordant experience of the elements retained. That any actual occasion belonging to an assigned species requires an environment adapted to that species, so that the presupposition of a species involves a presupposition concerning that environment. 4. That in every inductive judgment, and in every judgment of probability, there is a presupposition, implicit or explicit, of one or more species of actual occasions implicated in the situation considered, so that, by 3, there is a presupposition of some general type of environment. Thus, the basis of all probability and induction is the fact of analogy between an environment presupposed and an environment directly experienced. The argument as to the statistical basis of probability then recurred to the doctrine of social order. According to this doctrine, all social order depends on the statistical dominance in the environment of occasions belonging to the requisite societies. The laws of nature are statistical laws derived from this fact. Thus, the judgment of probability can be derived from an intuition, in general vague and unprecise, as to the statistical basis of the presupposed environment. This judgment can be derived from the analogy with the experienced environment. There will be such factors in experience adequate to justify a judgment of the inductive type. But there is another factor, from which, in combination with the four premises, a non-statistical judgment of probability can be derived. The principle of the graduated intensive relevance of eternal objects to the primary physical data of experience expresses a real fact as to the preferential adaptation of selected eternal objects to novel occasions originating from an assigned environment. This principle expresses the prehension by every creature of the graduated order of appetitions constituting the primordial nature of God. There can thus be an intuition of an intrinsic suitability of some definite outcome from a presupposed situation. There will be nothing statistical in this suitability. It depends upon the fundamental graduation of appetitions which lie at the base of things, and which solves all indeterminations of transition. In this way, there can be an intuition of probability respecting the origination of some novelty. It is evident that the statistical theory entirely fails to provide any basis for such judgments. It must not be thought that these non-statistical judgments are in any sense religious. They lie at a far lower level of experience than do the religious emotions. The secularization of the concept of God's functions in the world is at least as urgent a requisite of thought as is the secularization of other elements in experience. The concept of God is certainly one essential element in religious feeling, but the converse is not true. The concept of religious feeling is not an essential element in the concept of God's function in the universe. In this respect, religious literature has been sadly misleading to philosophical theory, partly by attraction and partly by repulsion.